Thanks very much, Saphia, and thank you to our institutional supporters, all the participants, of course, and everyone here. So I just wanted to say a very quick word about what we mean by the word holistic that's used in the title here. When it comes to the relationship between contemporary slavery, the environment and climate change in particular, what we mean is that these issues have always been intrinsically connected and mutually reinforcing, and they continue to be. We humans are shaped by as well as shape our environments, but our behaviors are also conditioned by relations of power, and those are the things that I think we want to tease out during the course of today. And just to give a very quick example, you may have been struck by the photograph that was used to advertise this event, which was taken in the Peruvian Amazon town of Nauta, and depicts the rubber boom in that region of the late 19th and early 20th century, when a British Commission of Investigation, very much pushed by the forerunner to Anti-Slavery International, discovered de facto slavery of indigenous people who were trapped by unpayable debts and coerced into delivering rubber under threat of torture, floggings, and murder. It's estimated that 40,000 indigenous people died, and large areas were deforested. And of course, the rubber went particularly to the automobile industry, but also to support a range of industrial activities that were associated with high carbon emissions, particularly in Europe and the US. What saved the indigenous of the region, if you like, was the invention of synthetic rubber after World War II. That was a byproduct of oil, and oil came to this region, to Nauta, in 1974. And while it didn't bring the same levels of forced labor as a lot of issues of trafficking for sexual exploitation, but also displacement of indigenous peoples and high levels of pollution, not to mention, of course, all the emissions associated with the fossil fuels. For the indigenous people, it's led to very high rates of cancer and diabetes that they never had before. And studies have shown that the indigenous people of the region have high levels of toxic heavy metals in their blood. Now the latest project in this region is to construct an Amazon waterway to link the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, with the goal of transporting automobiles, which again are linked to emissions, but also cash crops like cocoa and palm oil that are associated with labor exploitation and what have been called staggering rates of deforestation, all of which contributes again to climate change. So for that reason, also it's been said that these waterways will facilitate illicit activities like land, drug, and human trafficking. And for this reason, indigenous activists in this area call them routes of death. And it's also likely that it will worsen the impacts of climate change, particularly flooding, which will destroy fish stocks and displace indigenous people. So from this example, in this one contained region, the Peruvian Amazon, would we call this an indigenous rights crisis, a slavery crisis, a pollution crisis, or a climate crisis? I think we'd have to say it's all of those things, and it's those interconnections that we hope to explore today and to begin exploring today. We have, as Saphia said, a fantastic panel of speakers who are here to help us do just that, as well as all of those who are online, hopefully can contribute with their comments. So that's just to set the mood a little bit. Thank you for your attention, and I'll pass back to Saphia.
Thank you for that, Chris. So just a reminder to everybody who's not speaking to please turn your videos off. And you might find it helpful to use the view function at the top of the screen just to switch to speaker mode so that you only see the panelists rather than all of the other people who are joining us today. Okay, just before we launch into the panels then, I wanted to give a brief overview of why this subject and why the University of Hull. And of course, we were originally planning to host this event in person at the university, which unfortunately became difficult due to ongoing COVID restrictions. But the twin issues of slavery and climate change remain very much at the heart of the research and teaching that's conducted at the university. And Hull was the home of the abolitionist campaigner William Wilberforce, and today the city remains a focus for anti-slavery research and practice, particularly through the university's Wilberforce Institute for the study of slavery and emancipation. And Meanwhile, Hull University is also leading efforts to ensure a sustainable future through its Energy and Environment Institute. So I'd like to now invite the directors of these two institutes just to say a few words about why Hull is an important centre of research on these topics. And first of all, Trevor Burnard is Wilberforce Professor of Slavery and Emancipation and Director of the Wilberforce Institute. He's a specialist in the Atlantic world and slavery and plantation societies, and the author of Only Connect, a field report on early American history, Jamaica in the Age of Revolution, and the Atlantic world, 1492 to 1830. He recently curated a special forum in slavery and abolition on Black Lives Matter and slavery, and is curating another special issue for early American studies on Richard Dunn's Sugar and Slaves After 50 Years. He's a member of the AHRC Modern Slavery Policy and Evidence Centre and editor of the Oxford Online Bibliography in Atlantic History. So, Professor Burnard, over to you.
Thank you very much, Saphia, and it's a great pleasure to be able to welcome delegates and paper givers to this very important conference. And first of all, I'd like to commend both Christopher O'Connell and Saphia Fleury, who of course is one of our people at the Wilberforce Institute, someone who's very close to us at the Wilberforce Institute, for this particularly interesting and particularly appropriate conference, which comes at just about the start of what's going to be a flurry of activity, at least in Britain, on climate change, as we have a big conference on climate change in Glasgow, upon which so much of our hopes for future developments might be occurring. So it's a great pleasure, in particular, to thank Saphia and Christopher for putting forward such a fascinating program, for having the vision to develop this particular theme. And I urge with Saphia to suggest that this will be one of the start, I think, of several conversations about climate change and modern slavery. It's hard to think, I think, at a time as we deal with crises that we haven't really felt about are really becoming apparent to us at the moment. Climate change, of course, is becoming more and more a current concern. And the recent pandemic, let's say it's as recent, but it's moving into a new stage, whatever that stage might be. But the pandemic of the last couple of years has been very bad for the world, but very good for those perpetrators of modern slavery, which has been growing, as we've known, it's been growing for quite a long time and developing in all sorts of interesting ways. This conference is very important in linking together these two very dramatic themes within the current contemporary discourses. As Saphia pointed out, I'm a historian of transatlantic slavery, and I must say thank you, Saphia, for noting that a book that I haven't yet published but is about to publish next year, which is on early American history. So this particular, for both modern slavery and climate change, are things which I've come to quite late in the day. Saphia did mention, however, that I'm just putting forward a special issue on a book published in 1972 by Richard Dunn called Sugar and Slaves, which is about the introduction of slavery into the West Indies. 1647 is an interesting year. When slavery really became dominant in Barbados at exactly the same time as the Putney debates during the English Civil War brought forward ideas of liberty. So ideas of freedom and slavery have always been part of at least British, I'd say also European and perhaps global discourse for a very long time. It's also an important one because it's situated in Barbados, which was one of the first areas, and this connects with Christopher's comments to start off with about Latin America. Barbados was a place whereby we saw great environmental change, the chopping down of hardwood forests, the clearing of landscapes, which enabled the transatlantic slave trade and transatlantic slavery in the forms of plantation agriculture, sugar production to flourish in those, to develop in Barbados. So the relationships between climate change and slavery are of long standing, but are becoming particularly important today. And certainly as supervisor of one of Saphia's supervisors of her outstanding thesis, which after this conference is over, she'll get back to working on. I've become aware very much of the links between climate change and slavery within places that Saphia has been dealing with, such as Montserrat in the Caribbean and in Vietnam. Certainly one of the things that at the Wilberforce Institute we're in the planning stages of is a World Summit, World Freedom Summit, sometime perhaps in 2022 or probably in 2023, linking these two topics, climate change and modern slavery, something you'll hear about more in the future. So the conference today is very welcome and fits perfectly into the work on modern slavery, including climate change that the Wilberforce sees as part of its mission towards social justice, something which, of course, all institutions and all universities are eager to claim that they're doing. But I think at University of Hull, we can fairly say that social justice has been a feature of this university's outward mission for a long time, and is exemplified in the founding of the Wilberforce Institute in 2006. So today's conference very much fits in with what the Wilberforce Institute does, with what the University of Hull does in relationship to social justice, and also in relationship to environmental change, which Dan will talk about in more details. And I'm delighted to from Jasmine O'Connor from most Anti-Slavery International welcome at the beginning to panels on labor exploitation, human rights, ecosystems of vulnerability, to conflict, disaster, and migration. Conference delegates have a rare treat today. The Wilberforce Institute, I'll just very briefly say, talk about, is ideally an ideal place to host this conference. And in fact, it would be even more ideal if we'd been able to have some of this conference in person. Unfortunately, as Saphia pointed out, this has not been possible, but it would be lovely to be able to welcome at least some of you to our beautiful building in Old Town in Hull, next to where William Wilberforce was born. Our institute is named after William Wilberforce, who lived between 1759 to 1834. And I think he's an example of someone who shows what can be done in regard to combating a major social ill. In 1759, when Wilberforce was born, when Britain was winning victory after victory in the 7 Years' War, when it was expanding slavery throughout the Western world, the idea that the slave trade, let alone slavery, could be ended was very difficult for anyone to imagine. And certainly when Wilberforce decided in the 1780s to devote his life to this of abolishing the slave trade and then abolishing slavery, his friends thought it was a quixotic and silly thing to do for a man of his wealth, influence, and political importance. Similar things, I think, might be said today about both modern slavery and about climate change as well. And of course, being born in 1759 brings a certain irony about it. Wilberforce was devoted to ending the slave trade and slavery, but 1759 is commonly accepted as round about the decade, the 1750s and the 1760s, in which Britain really pushed ahead in what we call the Industrial Revolution, more an evolution than a revolution, but really important from the 1760s. It might be from that date that we date the Anthropocene, even though probably the last 50 years with what historians now call the Great Acceleration in terms of climate significance. The Wilberforce Institute is an institute devoted to the study of slavery in all forms, historical and and modern. And I think we've done many contributions, not only in historical slavery and such things as establishing the actual numbers of people who crossed the Atlantic and transatlantic period, but also in terms of modern slavery and outlining the extent of modern slavery, coerced labor in the world. And I won't go through the whole variety of things that Wilberforce has done, but certainly we have been recognized in a number of ways, including getting the Queen's Award in 2015, the highest award given to of higher education country for our work in providing about many people are in slavery and forms of coerced labor, which is in many millions of people around the world, and many places which are suffering from climate change. It's not coincidental that modern slavery and climate change are connected. But we've also been interested in putting forward policy, informing practice, and providing academic research in order to deal with modern slavery. And I'll just mention very briefly four things that we're doing which connect with modern slavery. Firstly, as Saphia mentioned, we are a member of a Modern Slavery Policy and Evidence Committee, an Arts and Humanities Research Council centre with a lot of funding to do research into modern slavery. And we're working with Alicia Kidd in particular on work on legal enforcement. We've just initiated, and we'll have a launch on the 21st of October, of a brand new alumni-funded Wilberforce Institute-supported Action to Combat Modern Slavery Justice Hub, which will provide continuing professional development for a range of people involved with having to deal with the Modern Slavery Act and its provisions. We're starting to have a relationship with the Salvation Army in regard to establishing a research agenda with them. And at a local level, we're important with the Humberside Modern Slavery Partnership. In short, the Wilberforce Institute is committed to combining policy, practice, and academic research on modern slavery. And in doing so, its work will necessarily coincide and interact with work by similar groups of scholars who are interested in climate change and in working out the interactions between policy, practice, and academic research there. So that's a little bit about the Wilberforce Institute. We're delighted to host this conference. Once again, congratulations to Saphia and Christopher for putting this conference together. I know you're going to have a wonderful day. I'm looking forward to the sessions that come forward today. And on behalf of the Wilberforce Institute, we'd like to welcome you virtually, if not in person, to the beautiful city of Hull and to the countryside and environment of Yorkshire. And I'm sure you're going to have a very good day. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Trevor, for that lovely introduction. So now if I could introduce Professor Dunn Parsons, who is an active researcher in areas related to fluvial, estuarine, coastal and peat marine sedimentary environments, exploring responses of these systems to climate and environmental change. For example, understanding how evolving flood risk on megadeltas can impact populations and related regional and global food security, through to understanding the impacts of plastics, particularly in coastal and marine environments. And as the director of the Energy and Environment Institute at Hull, Dan has gathered together an interdisciplinary team of over 160 researchers with a portfolio of active research grants and projects now totaling over £27 million. So Dan, if you'd like to say a few words about the work of your institute now, please.
Thanks so much, Saphia, and much of what I'll say will hopefully amplify and echo what Trevor was saying, and it just gives me great pleasure to welcome everybody onto the conference today. And again, just to say, fantastic job by Saphia and Chris to pull together today's meetings. I want to just welcome everybody by again just stressing the I think the important aspects of the University of Hull in this regard. So The new vision of the university is about a brighter, fairer, carbon neutral future. And I think that goes to the heart of the sorts of things that we'll talk about today. We talk about social justice, but the key aspect of climate change is the injustice. It's the impacts that climate change will have on those that are both least able to deal with the consequences and the impacts of climate change, but also those least responsible for the actual changes that are witnessing and impacting their lives. We talk about the historic legacies of both slavery and climate change into the Industrial Revolution, for example, with regards to climate change. But I think we need a modern perspective on both of these. 80% or close to 80% of the emissions of CO2 and greenhouse gases into the atmosphere have happened since the 1970s. So they happened in my lifetime, and probably most of you on the call too. When I was born, concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere was 332 parts per million. It's now 418. That's the lowest low. It goes up and down each year. That's the lowest low, the highest low that's ever been. So as we bounce out of this pandemic, our emissions are going back up again to the levels and re-meeting the trends prior to the pandemic. And indeed, the pandemic can put into context the challenge that lies before us as a global society. We shut down pretty much the entire global economy for about a quarter of the year last year. That resulted in a 6% reduction in CO2 emissions based on the year prior. That 6% is what we need to meet every single year between now and 2050 to meet the Paris Agreement's targets of 1.5 degrees warming. So it just puts into context the challenge that we have in meeting these goals and ceasing the very worrying trends that we're seeing in terms of the impacts of global climate change. I think there's two other things I'd just like to stress in this introduction. The first one is it's centered again around this issue of climate injustice. The UK is the fourth country by total cumulative emissions of CO2. So although we're in the between 10 and 20, depending on how you measure CO2 emissions, we're up in fourth place historically. And of course, lots of our wealth, our nation's wealth, has been built on a combination, indeed a nexus of climate change generating CO2 emissions and slavery. And we have to address that. We have to face up to the facts that these two things have resulted in lots of the net wealth we have as a nation now. And we have a moral responsibility to act to help ensure that those populations around the globe that will be impacted by climate change are assisted in terms of the impacts that are already built into the changes we're seeing, but also stave off the changes into the future too. I'll finish by just pointing towards COP26. There's a landmark report compiled by the World Bank that will be before COP26 in a few weeks' time. It estimates that 216 million people will be displaced by climate change by 2050. 40% of that will be from sub-Saharan Africa. 19 million alone will come from North Africa. That's some 10% of the population of that region. If you look at the destabilizing impact of migrations from Syria, it's a fraction of that volume of people being displaced. So we can just see the sorts of outcomes that we will see in terms of the big displacement of people generated by climate change into the future if we don't act and we don't start addressing the climate crisis front with. And I very much hope that COP26 will be a step towards the action matching the rhetoric of our political leaders. So with that, I will pass back to Saphia. Just say fantastic job again to the organisers. I'm very much looking forward to listening into all of the discussions and debates today, and yeah, just another warm welcome from myself, and thanks again.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Dan.